So last week we started looking at the Millennium, and we looked at the Millennium and the Messiah. Now this time I want to look at the Millennium and Israel's land, because God has things in the Old Testament that he writes concerning what the land's going to be like. So we're going to look at five things. The first thing is the geography of the land. Or you can put topography, because the land's going to change. The land's going to change. It's not going to stay the same. Okay? Through the wrath of God coming on the earth, and that whole period, which we call Daniel's 70th week, that period there, just before the Millennium, Jesus says certain signs are like birth pains. So out of the birth pains is going to come forth a birth, not just for the people of Israel, but even for the land. So through the earthquakes and through the huge shaking that's going to happen, the land is going to be remodeled and rebirthed. So let's first look at Isaiah. Let's go to Isaiah 2. Verse 2, and you'll see the same thing, almost the same wording in Micah 4 verse 1. Okay, Isaiah 2 verse 2, and it's almost the same wording in Isaiah 4 verse 1. It says, "Now it will come about that in the last days the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains, and will be raised above the hills, and all nations will stream to it." And we'll look at that in the future, next week, about the nations coming to Jerusalem. But notice it says Jerusalem is the chief of the hills. Now that has two meanings to it. Jerusalem, chief mountain. It means that, firstly, Jerusalem's going to be the most important mountain in the whole world. It's going to be the center of the earth. But the second is, it literally will happen. So what happens geographically has symbolic meaning to it. Because you see it, the same thing is written in Micah 4 verse 1, exactly the same. It will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains, and it will be raised, again the same wording, but literally lifted above the hills, and peoples will stream to it. Now this is how we know it is literal, because if you go to Zechariah 14, it actually tells us this is a literal thing. So, Zechariah 14 and verses 9 to 11. Okay. "And the Lord will be king over all the earth. In that day the Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one." Or literally, the Lord will be one and his name one. Because remember, in the Old Testament God says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one." God didn't want Israel to confuse the true God with the pagan gods. So what happened is Israel ended up doing that in the tribulation period, and in the whole of this Daniel's 70th week even, God's going to topple the gods and cause the remnant to forsake any false god. And the remnant of the Gentiles are going to forsake their false gods also. So the only one going to be worshipped is Jesus. All those other sacred hills and sacred mountains are going to be abased, brought down. Jerusalem's going to be raised up. That's the place of worship, and it's going to happen literally. So this is how God's going to do it. Verse 10. "All the land will be changed into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem." Geba is northeast of Jerusalem, and Rimmon is about 56 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem. So all around Jerusalem is going to become flat around Jerusalem. That whole vicinity will become flattened. It will become a broad plain of the earth. You should write that down for when we look at Gog and Magog. Around Jerusalem, it will become a broad plain on the earth. A broad plain. And we can imagine that there'll be even more broad plains even around that. Even though it's very specific here, we're going to see at the end of the millennium, nations are going to gather against Jerusalem as well. But look what it says. And it compares the area around Jerusalem to Jerusalem itself. But Jerusalem will rise and remain on its site from Benjamin's gate as far as the place of the first gate to the corner gate, and from the Tower of Hananel to the king's wine presses. So the whole city of Jerusalem is going to go up. Remember when we looked at the wrath of God right at the end, Jerusalem's going to be split into three. A tenth of the city will fall. The Mount of Olives is going to be split into two. One side going this way, one side going this way. All of that with the land around Jerusalem going flat is going to push Jerusalem up. That's what God's going to cause to happen. It's both geographical, it's physical, but it's symbolic as well. It stands for something, it means something. Jerusalem's going to be the most important place on the earth. People are going to live in Jerusalem, and there will no longer be a curse, for Jerusalem will dwell in security.
And in Ezekiel 5:5 it says, thus says the Lord God, this is Jerusalem, I have set her in the midst of the nations and the countries all around her.
Yeah. So if you turn quickly to Ezekiel, in a couple of weeks' time, we're going to look at the temple in the Millennium. The temple in the Millennium. And right at the beginning of looking at that temple, go to Ezekiel chapter 40. Ezekiel chapter 40. And verse 2. Okay. It's speaking about the temple that's going to exist in the millennium. And it says, in the visions of God, he brought me into the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain. And on it to the south there was a structure like a city. So he brought me there. Now the city is Jerusalem. The very high mountain is the mountain of Jerusalem. And right on the top of that mountain is going to be this temple. From Ezekiel 40 to 48, we read about it. But if you go to Ezekiel 47, we're going to read something very interesting about the temple and what comes out of it. So that's Ezekiel 47, verses 1, and that's to verse 12. In fact, also look at Zechariah 14 verse 8, because we didn't read that verse, but in verse 8 it says, in that day living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea and the other half toward the western sea. It will be in summer as well as in winter. So that was Zechariah 14 verse 8. Waters will come out of Jerusalem. Some of the waters will go towards the western sea, which is the Mediterranean. And some of them will flow towards the eastern sea. And guess where it's going to flow? It's going to flow to the eastern sea, which is the Dead Sea. And how's it going to get there? It's going to go like this. It starts out of Jerusalem, it's going to go this way, and then you're going to go down towards the Dead Sea. And on either side of this river is going to be the split Mountain of Olives that creates a valley between the two. The waters are going to flow through that valley, through the Mount of Olives. So if you turn back to Ezekiel chapter 47, it doesn't tell us about the waters that go to the Mediterranean, but it does tell us about the waters that go to the Dead Sea. And it says this: Then he brought me back to the door of the house, and behold, water was flowing from under the threshold of the house toward the east, for the house faced east. And the water was flowing down from the right side of the house, from the south of the altar. So what we see is the waters are going to come out from the eastern direction, and they're going to flow towards the eastern sea. And it's possible that some of those waters, which Ezekiel doesn't see, from that eastern side go towards the west, or there's going to be a western exit as well. We don't know. It doesn't say. But get this, underneath the temple today, there is a spring. There is water under the temple. It's been there since it was in there in the time of Hezekiah. And they called that water, or that spring, the Gihon spring. Gihon. Gihon, very, 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 very important, because if you go to Genesis, to the Garden of Eden, Gihon was one of the 4 headwaters that watered the earth from Eden. In other words, Jerusalem will be like the Garden of Eden, bringing life to the rest of the earth, if that makes sense. Yeah? So it says here in verse 2, he brought me out by way of the north gate and led me around on the outside to the outer gate by way of the gate that faces east. And behold, water was trickling from the south side. So you can see it's not moving in just one direction. It's moving from east down south towards the east again. And that's why, part of the reason why I think some of it could splinter off from there and go to the West Sea. It could come from the one source as opposed to 2 sources. But look at verse 3. When the man went out toward the east with a line in his hand, he measured 1,000 cubits, and he led me through the water, reaching the ankles. So he's wading through this river that's coming out toward the east. It comes out the south and goes towards the east. And he's walking and he's measuring it with a line. And it's up to the ankles at this point. So it's not, the water's trickling from there's not a lot of water coming out. But by the time they get there, 1,000 cubits down the road, it's up to the ankles. And it says in verse 4, again he measured 1,000 and led me through the water reaching the knees. Again he measured 1,000 and led me through the water reaching the loins. Again he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not ford, for the water had risen, enough water to swim in, a river that could not be forded. In other words, the water grows as it flows. That's not normal. Because it's not normal, some people say it's just a symbol, it's not real. But someone rising from the dead is not normal either. We don't see that every day. But after Jesus died, he rose again. We die, we don't rise again. Now, when Jesus comes back, we will all rise again and get a supernatural body. If God can do that to our mortal bodies, can he not do that to a stream of water? The Christians that turn around and say, oh, it can't be true because water doesn't do that. Well, bodies don't do that either, But they want to hold to the fact that there is a literal resurrection. Jesus did literally rise from the dead with a resurrection body, but he can't transform water. Well, our bodies are 70% water, so I think God could do it with an extra 30% of water and make it supernatural. And it's coming. Here's the point of this. It's coming from the temple. This water is water of life. It's living water. and it gives life wherever it goes. It's a symbol as well as something literal. That life comes from the presence of God. That's the meaning of it. And the other thing is, it grows. Jesus said about us, when we believe in Jesus, out of us will come rivers of living water, and by this he spoke of the Spirit. It just grows and grows and grows and grows. So there's a picture of the Holy Spirit here, the springs of salvation. Now look at this. In verse 6. He said to me, Son of man, have you seen this? And then he brought me back to the bank of the river. Now when I had returned, behold, on the bank of the river there were very many trees. Look at that. Very many trees. One on the right, on the side and on the other. So those trees, you'll see it in verse 12. By the river on its bank, on one side and on the other, will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither, and their fruit will not fail. They will bear every month, because their water flows from the sanctuary, and their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing. Now look at this. So you've got this river. On either side are lots of trees, all bearing fruit, and their leaf doesn't wither. This spring today only comes out at certain times of the year. It doesn't flow give out water continually, according to what I've read. That time, it will give water continually. It will give life to these trees, and the leaves of those trees will be for the healing of the nations. This river is a picture of the river of life in the New Jerusalem in heaven, the eternal Jerusalem. Okay? These trees are pictures of the tree of life. In Revelation, when we look at the eternal order, we'll see that there's only one tree on either side of the river. It must basically be huge and its roots span from one bank to the other bank with the river flowing underneath it, because it's on either side of the bank. But it's one tree in Revelation. These are many trees. It's pictures. These are pictures of that which will be in the New Jerusalem in heaven. In other words, the millennial reign is a foretaste, and we'll look at it in the future. But this millennium is a foretaste of that which is to come. And that'll be Revelation 21 and 22. The millennium is a foretaste of that which will come. It's a type and a picture of the eternal order. Okay? So let's go back. Now let's look at what it does to the Dead Sea. Then he said to me, these waters, verse 8. Then he said to me, these waters go out toward the eastern region and go down to the Arabah. Then they go toward the sea, being made to flow into the sea, and the waters of the sea become fresh. Now the Dead Sea apparently has 25% salination. 25% of it is salt. It's the saltiest piece of water on the earth. It's 6 times salty than the Mediterranean Sea. You can't dive down into it. You can float on it. And you don't get it in your eyes either. You know how seawater can sting when it gets in your eyes? You don't want the Dead Sea water to get into your eyes. There's that much salt in it. Nothing grows. That's why it's called the Dead Sea. This water's going to clean up the Dead Sea and make it fresh. Now, that is miraculous. And that is never happened, ever before. But when Jesus comes back, it's going to happen. And look what it says. So the waters become fresh. And it says in verse 9, it will come about that every living creature that swarms in every place where the river goes will live. And there will be very many fish. For these waters go there, and the others become fresh, so that everything will live where the river goes. And it will come about that fishermen will stand beside it, from En-Gedi to En-Eglaim. There will be a place for the spreading of nets. Their fish will be according to their kinds, like the fish of the great sea, very many. Not meaning that the fish that's in the Mediterranean Sea will be there in the Dead Sea, because the Mediterranean Sea is a salt sea, and that Dead Sea will become fresh water. You're dealing with fresh water fish, but just as there's very many kinds of fish in the Mediterranean, there will be very many kinds of fish in the Dead Sea. And they'll be fishing there. And look at this. Verse 11, but its swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They will be left for salt. It is not perfect. It is like heaven. It's like going back to the Garden of Eden, but it's not perfect. There's still edges left for salt, and there's a good reason for that. Because they will need salt for the sacrifices in the temple, which we'll look at in 2 weeks' time. So this probably will be one of the places where they will get their salt from. So look at this. It says, and we've read verse 12, but the river and its bank on the one side and the other side will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither and their fruit will not fail. These are pictures not just of the tree of life. They're pictures of us too. Psalm 1. We'll be like trees planted by streams of living waters coming out, whose leaf does not wither and it bears fruit in its season. But the season is all the way through the year. That's the season. The scripture says we're to speak the word in season and out of season. Our season is always. On the one hand, when you grow, there is time that you're growing in the Lord before you start to see that fruit of the Lord taking effect in our lives. But on another hand, the walk God is calling to us to, He wants us to be fruitful always. Something we grow into. But these trees are always bearing fruit. They will not fail. So look at this, what we've seen about the geography. Jerusalem's going to be raised up, everything's going to be flat, and there's going to be living water coming from the temple. And you can see why the Jerusalem would need to go so high, so that when the water comes out, it flows, because the gravity will drag it all the way down to the Dead Sea and drag it to the Mediterranean Sea. So the rest of the land becomes a plain.